Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Catch of Kings podcast. I'm your host, Emil and Lazaro. I am the podcast editor and a writer for The Hurricane, a regular writer. I write for a lot of the sections, but what we're talking about today has to do with the opinion section. I am joined here by my co-host, Lazaro Chavez, if you want to introduce yourself.
All right, so what's up, guys? I'm Lazaro. I'm joined here, obviously, by my good friend Emil, and I'm one of the senior writers here at the Miami Hurricane. I also happen to be president of College Republicans on campus.
Yeah, so what we're going to be talking about today is just a little bit about Mamdani's win. Zohran Mamdani, the assembly member from Queens, who has now won the mayoral race in New York City. And our thoughts on his campaign and the victory, and then our thoughts about the future for U.S. politics. And before we continue, obviously, I am going to be the left side of this view, and then Lazaro is going to be the right side of this view. And obviously, I do have to clarify, opinions do not reflect any of the opinions of the Miami Hurricane. Obviously, these are our own opinions and not associated with the Miami Hurricane. First off, Zohran Mamdani's win. Like, the first question I think that we have to cover today, why do we think he won? Was it campaign strategy? Was it messaging, identity, opposition, anything else?
Well, I certainly think it had to have been a mix of multiple factors. And for sure, one of them had to be the people he was up against. I think, first and foremost, you're up against a former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, which, first and foremost, I think, yes, is it the biggest city in the world? Of course it is. But are you really staging your political comeback and on a mayoral race? And obviously, I mean, if he had won the mayoral race, which was very slim to begin with, he obviously would have used that to embolden himself to run for president. I mean, that was just going to happen. And he was up against a very weak Republican candidate. I think the party could have ran somebody a lot stronger, but, they renominated Sliwa after he lost in 2021 to Adams. So I think, he had a very, very easy pool of opponents for him to beat. And I think it is a lot of his strategy. I mean, even Trump said, you guys were not out there. Republicans were not out there enough to campaign, and they didn't even the bad Democrat didn't campaign strong enough. So I think, Mamdani had quite a strategy in how he campaigned. I mean, he campaigned on issues that mattered to the voters of New York. The cost of living, the rent, whether or not I agree with the way he's going to go about it, which I don't, he's going to these issues that matter to voters and meeting them where they're at, not bringing them to the issues that he thinks are important. It's the issues he thinks that he knows are important to New Yorkers. And also social media had to do a lot of it. I think the videos he did were masterful. I would implement them if I was running in the campaign, some of those strategies as well. And identity, I think, embracing that part of politics, your culture, maybe a little bit, not playing too much into identity politics. I mean, I don't think he really did too much, but he, it showed in the way of his social media, of his banners and his signs. They reflected who he was, and I think that's something that probably helped him a lot.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The main thing for me was that, the opposition was weaker than it could have been. I think Sliwa did a good job within, I don't think we ever expected a Republican to win in New York City, which is a very democratic city.
Not by a long shot.
No, but he still led, I think, a pretty impressive campaign in the way that he handled himself and the charisma. And also with Cuomo, like, he had a lot of sexual harassment allegations, and I think that really hurt his chances because when you have allegations like that, it's something for your opponent to grab onto and be like, do you really want this person? Do you really want, like, this reflection of character to be in office? And then, I mean, for me, the biggest thing was his strategy and his messaging, because I saw a video that, it was studying how many times he would say affordability in his videos versus Cuomo, for example. And he would say affordability maybe, like, 44 times during, like, his campaign messages. And I think that's really important because he not only went out as a grassroots movement and talked to people on the street, but then he came back and when he's organizing his videos, he's like, okay, we got to talk about the things that people matter. And he really just latched onto that and didn't deviate from that at all. Like, when he would talk about, speaking out about Islamophobia or transphobic or anything else, he still stuck to the affordability message. When they would ask him about, whether he was anti-Semitic or anything, he would stick to, I am running to make life better for all New Yorkers, regardless of who they are, whether it be Jewish New Yorkers, trans New Yorkers, anything. And I think that really was a different perspective and a different strategy from the larger Democratic Party in recent years. And yeah, I mean, we saw the results. He won by like 10% more than Cuomo, which is really impressive. But now, the immediate effects of his victory. We have first Trump already, during the race, he was very like attacking on Mamdani. He would call him a communist, et cetera, like because obviously they are on ideological opposites, and he did not want him to win. He wanted someone like Cuomo who was more willing to like work with Trump to win. Now, right after the race, Trump kind of stepped back a little from that and said, "Oh, maybe we will be willing to work with Mamdani." And Mamdani, even when asked, he said, "I am going to talk to Trump." And there was some consensus that they are willing to work together. How do you think that's going to go about for the next year or so?
Well, I mean, obviously, you have Trump. He's already, this is a midterm year coming up. He's basically on his way out of not only the presidency, but just probably politics in general. So I think he's doing his job as president, working with trying to work with the local government in New York. Obviously, Mamdani's going to need both federal and state support for some of the policies he wants to implement. Regarding public transportation is probably a really big one, where that a lot of that is left up to the state. So maybe he's gonna have to work with Kathy Hochul, who even though she endorsed him, he kind of just like pushed her aside when the other two candidates were asked about her in a debate. Kind of just like push her to the side. So I think Trump is doing the thing where he needs to obviously work with local government to ensure that New Yorkers get what they need, not necessarily start flustering with the political aspect of it. And I think that what we saw before is obviously just campaign politics. I mean, that's normal. It's been a thing for the longest time, even before Trump, even before Mamdani. It's been a thing. So that's just normal campaigning, and now he's working to get something for New Yorkers.
And then, I mean, you mentioned Hochul. I think it's going to be really interesting with Hochul because she recently not strictly opposed making free buses a thing, because the Metro Transit Authority in New York is under state authority.
Correct.
But she did say it would be harder. She did say maybe it's open to subsidizing or things like that. So that's already one challenge that Mamdani is going to come across, especially as Hochul is probably going to have to run for re-election in 2026, which we're going to talk about in a second. She's probably going to be very concerned about that and going to be watching her interactions with Mamdani for her re-election chances. Now, what other challenges do you think Mamdani will come across?
Well, I mean, he certainly, he campaigned on, well, he didn't campaign on it, but he mentioned he wouldn't let ICE agents, get involved with the city. Obviously, this is a federal thing. If you're a federal order, if you're getting in the way of a federal order, I mean, we've seen it before with Governor George Wallace, pardon me. Governor George Wallace in the 1960s with desegregation. Desegregation, obviously, this is on the opposite side of the political spectrum, right? You're talking about completely separate issue. George Wallace was not going to let these students integrate into the University of Alabama. He wasn't going to let it happen. And so, under the guise of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and who was under the guise of President John F. Kennedy, said, no, that's not going to happen. National Guard came in, federalized, and quite literally grabbed Wallace, moved him out of the way, and let the students in. And so, that's, I think, one challenge Mamdani will for sure face. I think he may face also some resistance from within the state legislature about other things that he has to coordinate with the state government. Again, transportation is a really big one. Perhaps there's going to be a part of that legislature, part of that Democratic bloc that's going to be like, no, we can't give you this much. We have a certain allocation of funds, so we can't really do all that. And I think he'll also face resistance from business owners who perhaps for his government-owned grocery stores and for the rent freezing policy, who are just going to straight up try to resist it as much as they can.
Yeah. I also wonder how much resistance he's going to face from his own coalition, right? Because he is a Democratic Socialist of America member, and the DSA notably stopped endorsing Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez when she started to go a little bit against the guidelines of the organization. So I wonder whether he will face resistance from the DSA when he has to, come a little bit to the center to work either with Hochul or with the establishment or with Trump to get some things passed. Because obviously he can't do everything himself. He has talked about Trump-proofing certain laws because, New York City does have its own funds. The state of New York has its own funds that doesn't need from the federal government. So he has talked about Trump-proofing. So I think that is one thing to watch to see how he does it, because I know it's possible, and especially like in states like New York where like they pay more into the federal government than they receive.
Yep.
It is possible, but I am interested to see how that works, how he's going to implement that, especially since I don't. Is he in office yet? No, right?
No, he will be in office New Year's afternoon, I believe. New Year's
Okay.
Day.
So yeah, that it'll be interesting to see how we go into 2026 with that. So moving on, we do have to talk about the future. 2026 midterms. What response for you? You're a Republican. What response do you think the Republican Party will give to Mamdani's win, especially going into 2026 midterms?
Well, certainly, I think it's going to be more so campaigning again on the issues that won them back three branches of government or two branches of government in 2024. A campaign on the issues of inflation, which obviously there's been a lot of that this year, even though our party kind of promised some things and we couldn't deliver this year, unfortunately. But there are things that we can continue to work on. Since this is an election year, we can still try to work with Democrats. We could still try to get these super majorities that we need to get certain things passed. Campaign on border security. I think that was a very big important issue, and crime, and I think which would be in the local and state level, that could be a game changer. Is school choice. I think school choice is going to be a very important issue in 2026. I think a lot of people across the country and especially independents, are very much pro school choice. Being able to say that I can send my kid to here, not just the school that's in my area. So I think that's going to be another important issue, and it's another thing, embracing certain culture and embracing this particular block of voters that really came out for President Trump in November of last year, which was Hispanic men. Hispanic men came out for Donald Trump by, I believe, 54% of the vote from them. So I think, embracing that identity, maybe perhaps young, charismatic Hispanic men going for certain seats, and also having as a surrogate out there, the highest ranking Hispanic person in the federal government and in the federal government's history, Secretary of State Rubio, I think would be a great choice to have him out there as a surrogate of the campaign. Not to mention he's also been floated by the president as a potential successor come 2028.
What response, before we get to like my side of things, what response do you think like the general public, especially those who are moderate right, will have to Mamdani's win, especially outside of New York City?
Well, his win is one thing. I mean, look, it's the win is one thing. Governing is another thing.
Mm-hmm.
His win, obviously, I mean, it shocked me. Obviously, being the grandson of political prisoners from Cuba who experienced at least a version of socialism, whether we agree on what socialism is or not. Experience a version of it, having things taken away and stuff like that. And so, to that community, I think the win is a shock. I think that it's coming to America. I think people on the right and the moderate side are going to be, skeptical of Mamdani. This is a person who's saying he's going to make the government own grocery stores. I mean, make the government own this and that.
Yeah.
That's something that scares a lot of people. And so the win is already scary enough. Now let's see how he implements it. If he's successful in governing and in doing that, let me rephrase that. Not successful governing. That's a different thing. If he's successful governing, obviously that's great for New Yorkers.
Yeah.
But successful in implementing those policies that he's promising, that is where I think the difference will be made. And that's when we'll be able to see kind of more of a defined reaction from Republicans on that aspect. But his win, I think the reaction to the win is going to be bringing out younger, charismatic, tech-savvy, social media-savvy candidates.
Yeah. I mean, on the Democratic side of things, obviously I'm not a Democrat, but it's the closest thing I have, I think, to my party. Here in the United States, I think the main issue that the Democratic Party had going into 2024 was messaging. Because one bill that I wish, or not one bill, but one policy that I wish that they had promoted more, like in their messaging, was the IRA, the infrastructure, whatever. Like that was a really important bill that's still having effects now across the states. And that has helped, I think, Trump's presidency a lot. Obviously, presidents always benefit from their predecessors or suffer, depending on how they did. And I really think that if Mamdani's policies work, it will not matter to candidates outside of New York unless they message it correctly, unless they market it correctly. On the side of people, obviously there is this left block of voters in the United States. They do not have proper representation, in my belief, because there is no real like social democratic party like we have in Europe. However, there are more and more progressives, but I think they have to really rally around progressive candidates going into 2026, because right now it's a minority. Even in the Democratic Party, it's a minority. Bernie Sanders has talked about it over and over again, that it's still a minority in the House. In the Senate, there's only, I think Bernie Sanders is really the only progressive besides maybe a few others. And there is no real progressive bloc yet that could really take some type of leadership role in the Democratic Party. So I think, especially within the Democratic Party, that progressive bloc has to come out and rally voters behind them to really, because it won't matter unless they get leadership within the Democratic Party. And I think that's what's going to really matter going into 2026. And obviously, like what I said about the messaging and marketing Mamdani's policies, regardless of whether they win or lose.
Because how do you suggest like that those progressives? Because obviously, I guess you could say it's the equivalent of the left's equivalent of the MAGA movement. Whether they're very different, but you can kind of argue that it's the same. That they're moving a skewer to the right than traditional conservatism, and they challenged the MAGA wing challenged traditional conservatives like Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, a couple other ones that were completely like basically extinct at this point. So how do you suggest that these progressives come in and kind of just, shake shop and kind of, do they go in and they challenge these establishment candidates in a primary? Could we see somebody like, for example, now that Nancy Pelosi is retiring, could we see somebody that she's backing from her district be challenged by someone who's more progressive?
Yeah, I mean, it's about primaries, especially in a system like the United States. You really, there is no option of having another party. We saw with MAGA, he went through the Republican Party, not with an outside party. And I think it's the same with the Democratic Party. We have to go through primary elections. Bernie Sanders has already talked about it. There's certain caucuses within the DSA that are very focused on working within the party and with primaries to get more progressive candidates in. And it's just about marketing. It's about marketing within the party, obviously, because you have moderates within the Democratic Party as well that you have to convince. So it depends on how Mamdani does, and on the marketing, in my opinion. So yeah, our final thing, candidates to watch specifically. For me, the first person I want to talk about is Graham Plattner from Maine. He is running for governor against, some pretty competitive people. He is a populist. He is an outsider. He is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, which is, I think, very rare to see on the left side. Usually for armed forces people, you usually see them more moderate or to the right. So that was something I really saw that was interesting. He is an underdog, and he has already a connection to Mamdani, because one of Mamdani's top advisors, Morris Katz, helped produce the launch video for his campaign. One thing, however, is that he has a few controversies. I think you mentioned something about someone who's anti-Semite on your side of the aisle, but he has a history of Reddit posts that were deemed anti-Semitic. I haven't seen them myself, but I'm going to take them at their word. Though he has obviously come out and said, like, hey, that was, like, in the past, like, that's not reflective of who I am today. And I think it'll be really interesting to see. It's obviously a different form of identity than we saw with Mamdani, but it'll be really interesting to see whether people can really put policy over identity, whether he markets himself correctly and convinces people to look past his identity and look at his policy. And then obviously whether he delivers on his policy if he wins the governorship.
And something I noticed, while yes, Mamdani did kind of, dabble in the whole, Trump hate and the Trump saying he's going to Trump-proof the city, right? I mean, Trump wasn't necessarily a factor for New York City voters. Only 40% of them said that, Trump had a factor within their vote. And Mamdani wasn't really necessarily, on the campaign trail every day attacking Trump either.
Yeah.
So it begs the question, are these progressives going to do something different from the establishment Democratic Party, where it's kind of become just a Trump hate party, where they really it's campaigning basically to go against him and not necessarily saying that they're going to implement XYZ policy?
Yeah. For me, I think it's more important to run on policy. Like you said, he ran more against Cuomo, which leads me to my point. I think it's more about, for the left, especially for progressives and DSA members. It's more about a united front against the right, because you have obviously like ideological opposition. It's more about a united front against the opposition as a whole, not one singular member. Because with Trump, he's gonna be gone, you know, unless we have like a free for all between Obama, Clinton, and Trump within the next 4 years. He's not gonna run for re-election. He's a what is it called, lame duck president.
Yeah, he's a lame duck right now.
So it's more about being a united front against the right, against what some view as authoritarianism or whatever you may call it. It's about that united front, and especially against the establishment within the Democratic Party, because they're going to try to primary those people out of office. So it's going to be interesting to see in the 2026 midterms how that comes to fruition, how that pops up in certain places, and whether they win. Because, you know, it's one thing like if they lose by 40% points, or if they lose by 10%, or if they win by close margins or something like that. So that's something I'm interested to see, honestly.
Yeah, and then I have just one kind of candidate that I'm looking at because, as we know, or I hope people know, Joni Ernst, senator from Iowa, kind of moderate, still conservative by modern, you know, political standards, but relatively moderate by most standards. She's not seeking re-election to another term in the United States Senate. So currently, it's kind of a free-for-all in the primary for her seat. And the person who's trying to run for it is a congresswoman by the name of Ashley Hinson, young, kind of charismatic a little bit, super Trump ally, very much America First, MAGA person all on the right side of it. And she won her district when she ran for Congress again last year. She won it by 57% of the vote, which is pretty big in politics. Even, you know, whether it's how do I put this? Whether it's a couple percent points or not. I mean, 57% is still quite big to win in politics, is what I'm trying to make the point. So I think she could be somebody viable there. We may watch former Chair Whatley, former RNC Chair Whatley. He's running for the North Carolina seat that's being vacated, but he's also up against a more moderate guy on the Democratic side who's probably going to get the nomination, which is former Governor Roy Cooper.
Yeah.
So that's another one to watch. And, you know, maybe Byron Donalds. I think Byron Donalds could shake things up. He's not obviously, I think, an equivalent to Mamdani at all, but he's charismatic, young, a minority figure he's an African American running for governor in a southern state, and there's only been a handful of black governors in the country to begin with. Yeah. So should he win next year, he gets to the primary, wins the nomination, wins the general election, he'd be the first African American in the governorship of Florida, and I believe the fifth black governor period in the country. Yeah. It'd also be the first biracial couple to hold the governor's mansion there because his wife is a white woman. So I think he'd be very interesting to watch. He was also on Trump's shortlist for vice president last year. And he's a very interesting guy. I think, you know, he has an opponent on the right who is just condemnable. You know, you have James Fishback. He's a condemnable guy. He's the one you mentioned earlier that I had said. It's a condemnable guy and kind of a surrogate for another figure on the right that I'm not too big a fan of. So definitely, I think Hinson, Donalds are for sure two people to watch for because I think Donalds could make a lot of waves.
I do want to ask you something since you are a Republican. Now that Trump is, as I said, a lame duck president, do you think it's important to separate yourself from the MAGA movement at this point? Because, I mean, he is a populist. So as far as I know, like in my experience, when I look at populist movements, the minute the figure that is the center of that populist movement, you know, leaves politics or passes away or whatever, like they're out of the picture, that populist movement tends to dissolve. So do you think the MAGA movement is going to continue past Trump, or do you think now's the time to create a new movement or separate yourself from that movement or something like that?
That's an interesting question. And I'll tell you what, I think it has to be sort of a mix of both. And I think it also has to do with kind of moving the parties, both parties, in my opinion, but specifically the Republican Party. I think we need to move back to right of center. I think we got to move back to that to that compassionate conservatism George W. Bush promoted, while also still embracing some of the good from the MAGA movement, from the America First movement. What that means is, like, right now they should be starting to look already for a new figure to get behind.
Yeah.
Now, I think a great figure to get behind would be Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Young guy, by political modern standards, young. He's 50-something, but he's young for political standards. Charismatic guy, family, Hispanic, a growing block of the electorate, whether it's men, women, left or right. Hispanic population in this country is growing exponentially. It's growing hugely.
Yeah.
So to have somebody who very well polished as well, very well educated guy, went to UF for his undergrad, and for his law degree. So I think it's a very well educated guy who's somebody that I think the party can get behind. Now, it's whoever they find for vice president is a different story, but I think someone like him you can get behind, or somebody like maybe J.D. Vance as well. Vance has been floated as well. He's obviously the sitting vice president. History won't do him any favors, because the last time that a sitting vice president was elected was in 1988, and before that in 1836. So not really the greatest thing. But Vance has an interesting story. It's a biracial couple. Him and an Indian woman, Usha Vance. They have a young family. He comes from he climbed his way up basically from poverty, a drug abuse home, physical abuse, and moved his way up. Went to Yale and Harvard, became a military man, and just this great story. And so I think that's something else for them to look at as well. Just finding a new figure while trying to define what's the next step rather than moving away from Trump. I think Trump will still have an effect on the party for at least another cycle or two.
Yeah.
And I think he'll also have an effect on the left as well for a couple cycles as well.
Similarly, I think for Mamdani shows that it would be very beneficial for the Democratic Party to adopt kind of a grassroots strategy again. And they are an open tent party, but I think it would be good if they kind of went to a grassroots type of party, because Mamdani showed that it worked. And I think a lot of the establishment didn't believe that it would work, and really put a lot of emphasis into putting powerful politicians or elite politicians in power. So I hope that there's more, regular people who want to run, whether it be on progressive, moderate, or right policy. So that would be my want for it. The last candidate I want to talk about before we end off this podcast, Abdul El Sayed from Michigan. He's running for a Senate race. He is a progressive activist. He is running in a very competitive Democratic primary, and he is Muslim. So I think that's going to be round 2 of, how much Islamophobia can hurt races, because with Mamdani, I think we saw a very similar scenario to, when JFK first ran, and there was a lot of anti-Catholic rhetoric back when there was more anti-Italian rhetoric or anti-Jewish rhetoric. In the history of the United States, there's always a time when there's the first this or the first that. And with Mamdani, we saw obviously the first Muslim mayor of New York City. So as more cultural groups start to get accepted, in the political culture of the United States, I think it'll be really interesting if El Sayed can win, because that'll show kind of that more acceptance in the political culture. But yeah, before we end off, is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think it's just a matter of, I think right now for the future, at least for the midterms, I think what's gonna happen is gonna happen. I think for at least New York, I could see the governor's race maybe being a real challenge, because I think Mamdani's policies could make or break for Hochul. She endorsed him. Part of the assemblies and the legislature are kind of supporting him as well. So if they're behind his policies, is that going to impact allowing a Republican to be elected governor? We saw that Elise Stefanik, who was the UN ambassador nominee for Trump earlier this year, before she withdrew just for House majority reasons. Could we see her maybe win it and make a challenge for her? Because a lot of Republicans in New York, or rather independents in New York, are shifting right. So it could prove to be a challenge for Hochul in her reelection bid. And for 28, I think it's just a matter of both parties finding that groove that goes back to the middle for both parties and hitting the issues that matter to voters. Kind of, Mamdani went about it obviously in a further to the left way than I would have, but He went to the issues that matter to voters: affordability,
Yeah.
especially in New York. New York is an incredibly expensive city to live in, and so he hit it very hard and very well, frankly, for what it is.
To your point, since we have to talk about Florida, I think before we end off, how, there's obviously issues that matter to voters in Florida. There are still obviously affordability issues in places like Miami. There are other issues like environmental issues, especially in places that are affected a lot by hurricanes or by flooding and stuff like that in Florida. Um, how important do you think it is to touch on those issues more often in Florida?
I mean, it depends also on the district and the constituency. Obviously, a city like Miami, affordability, you have to hit it on the head. And the county too. You have
Yeah.
to, affordability. This city is expensive, especially being someone who grew up here. I've seen the prices go up. I've seen them climb. Ding, 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 go up. So I know it from personal experience, seeing it. That's an issue that really really matters. Another issue that also matters, public infrastructure. I mean, the city of, for example, Hialeah is got some pretty much a lot of work that needs to be done with the infrastructure, and that's the reason why candidates got involved a lot with it this year, as well as the water. Water was a big cost for people in Hialeah. So it's refining your message, and when you've been involved in a political campaign like I was, because for disclosure how would I call this? Disclosure purposes. My sister ran a campaign for city council early this year for Hialeah, and so I was there seeing what mattered to voters. We talked to voters and we saw that these were issues that mattered to them. The water bill, the water bills were extremely high.
Yeah.
The water was coming out dirty. The infrastructure of it was just horrible, and that's what voters want to change, and that's what they ended up electing people for that as well. So I think it's just refining your message to your constituency. If flooding is going to matter, for example, voters in the Keys. For voters,
Yeah.
that's going to matter to them.
In Monroe County.
Or how would you call this? Gentrification probably would matter in Central Florida, because that's an area that's very rural, very, very. Some of them that are urban as well, but they're coming in with like a bunch of industry.
A bunch of development, yeah.
Yeah, because I've seen it. I go
Even
to Orlando
here,
frequently.
like in
Oh, yeah,
Southeast
and here
Florida,
too.
yeah.
But in Orlando particularly, I mean, I used to go when I was a kid all the time, and every time I go up there was nothing. There was nothing there.
Yeah.
But now I go, and every month there's something new. So it's like, that I think that's an issue there that you could talk to your voters there. That's an
Yeah.
issue for them that matters. So it's based to your constituency, I think, is what matters. Refining that to them.
On the state level, because we're talking about citywide level or municipality level, it's nonpartisan on the municipal level, or supposed to be at least. On the state level, how do you think, at least on my side, or sorry, on your side first, how do you think the right can message policy to voters, especially like on these issues like affordability and stuff?
I mean, it's just, at least in Florida, man, it's just kind of just redoing what DeSantis has done and what Scott did before him and what the Republican Party has been doing here. Just kind of just keep messaging on what they see matters to them. Affordability specifically, DeSantis has toted about perhaps getting rid of property taxes. That could have an impact on schools and a couple of other things as well.
And on just funding for Florida in general.
And exactly. So that's something that perhaps, that has to be looked more into before they continue campaigning on it. But it's something that's been brought up and something that some voters are actually getting on board with. So it's about that. And, I think in Florida also another problem is, and it's historic, this has been historic even when Democrats were in charge down here. Usually the election that matters is to keep the primary. So that's another issue and a half to get into. But I think that's kind of the point I wanted to make.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned it, because you mentioned it earlier when we were talking more about Mamdani and Miami. There are a lot of Cubans down here who remember, and not just Cubans, Venezuelans as well, because the populism we saw from Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela was also a leftist populism that turned into authoritarianism. The same with Cuba; it was communism. And for me, as a progressive and a leftist who has lived like among this wonderful community down here in South Florida, I see a lot of Cubans and Venezuelans who, if you just tell them the policies, like they'll be more willing to support it, especially when you don't frame it as socialism. When you just frame it as policy that is meant to help people, if you're running it on nonpartisan, they're more willing to accept it. So I think it's really about messaging and about healing the trauma of these communities, because there's a lot of there's a lot of generational and cultural trauma. The stuff that they went through in Cuba and Venezuela is traumatic. Like, they went through a lot of
Horrific, to say
things
the
to just
least.
to just get to here in Miami. And I think for progressive and leftists who want to run in Miami, or just in Florida in general, you really have to adapt your message to where you are. Because if you run as, Mamdani didn't really do this, but if you run kind of like as framing yourself as a commie or something, you're not going to win. You have to be very...
I mean, we saw there was a woman here that
Yeah.
Fidel Castro was her hero.
Yeah, you have to be very understanding and empathetic for the pain that
Right.
these communities have gone through. So
But
I
I think
think
it's also, as a candidate, you kind of also have to understand why these policies to these people are like you're getting to the point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why these policies are so negative for them and have such negative connotations in it. I mean, yes, the methodology and the thought behind it is a nobility sort of way.
Yeah.
We want to help people. But you're also asking people to give up X, Y, Z that they worked for God knows how many
to
years
pay,
for.
yeah.
So
To-
it's
But it's the same thing with property taxes, with trying to take away property
Exactly.
taxes. Like,
You're
how are
taking
we
away-
going to pay for things?
how are we gonna pay for certain
exactly.
things?
But at the same time, you have to talk about affordability. So even besides the messaging side of things, Mamdani's going to face this right now. When you promote these policies and when you want to really bring socialist or social democratic policies or democratic social, whatever you want to call it, when you want to bring these progressive politics to the table, you have to deliver, because you're asking a lot from people on the expectation that you're going to deliver for them, that you're going to make use of their money and give it back to them. That's why in Europe it works. For example, in Sweden, the reason people are so willing to pay these taxes is because they're getting things back from the government. Like, they're getting their money's worth. And so if we really want to bring, public control of these services, like whatever it may be, transportation, healthcare, childcare, whatever it may be, you have to really deliver. So I think that's the most important thing for progressives in Florida. Not so much, obviously you have to market it and be very empathetic and understanding of who you're talking to and who you're marketing to, but also you have to deliver once you're there. You can't just BS your way through. You can't just get to office and then, not do anything with it. That has been Catch of Canes. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Laz, for co-hosting with me. Hopefully
you
we
for
can
having
do more of this in the future. But yeah, that's been it. Thank you guys.